Grab your hiking boots and sleeping bags, because it's time for summer camp in the rugged Coagulation Cascades. That's right, while campers trek through the picturesque wilderness and try not to get too many cuts and scrapes, we'll look at the clotting process, including the intrinsic, extrinsic, and common pathways. But before we get into the nitty gritty, some background. Forming a clot involves a lot of intermediate steps and a bunch of coagulation factors. These factors start life as inactive plasma proteins that are converted or activated into enzymes, which then catalyze subsequent enzymes in the cascade. A kind of chain reaction. Most of these factors are initially produced by the liver. 4 of them are considered vitamin K dependent factors because vitamin K is necessary for their production by the liver. This includes factors 10, 9, 7, and 2, aka prothrombin. In addition to these coagulation factors, there are 2 vitamin K dependent anticoagulant proteins, proteins S and C, that prevent overcoagulation. To help you remember this, we've blasted back to the year 1972 and marked out Sketchy Summer Camp with this Kids Summer Camp sign, emphasis on the K, S, and C. These vitamin K dependent factors are important to remember because drugs that inhibit the activation of vitamin K, like warfarin, will prevent the liver from producing adequate or fully functional coagulation factors, producing an anticoagulant effect. This is also why the effects of warfarin can be reversed by giving vitamin K or even eating vitamin K-rich foods, such as leafy green vegetables. All right, with that out of the way, let's survey the area, starting with this cascading waterfall within the trees, which will represent the intrinsic pathway. This pathway, also known as the contact activation pathway, begins with factor 12. Factor 12 is activated on contact with activated platelets or on contact with collagen or basement membrane following damage to endothelial cells. Hence why these 12-shaped dead trees with collagen-like triple helix trunks are at the top of our cascade. Once activated, factor 12 then catalyzes the conversion of factor 11 to 11A, which is represented by these 11, or Roman numeral 11, shaped signs warning of dangerous rapids. But where do these rapids lead? Is there a detour? And what danger lies ahead? Speaking of danger, that's one giant squirrel, and he looks hungry for blood. In addition to terrorizing campers, you'll notice he's also shaped like the number 9, because he represents the conversion of factor 9 to 9A, which is catalyzed by factor 11A. And yep, we've taken a little bit of a detour since we skipped factor 10. For now. Clearly, this camper has been here before, and he's got the designer VWF brand backpack and double-seater float to prove it. But more than a style statement, his 8-shaped inner tube represents factor 8, which normally circulates inactive while attached to von Willebrand factor, or VWF. Factor 8 becomes activated when a blood vessel is damaged, or by thrombin, factor 2A, which we'll talk about a little later. That's why this lad has ditched his VWF brand backpack and is actively having the time of his life tubing down the rapids. We've now reached the end of the intrinsic pathway, but before we leave these trees, it's important to note that factor 8A, separated from von Willebrand factor, acts as a cofactor for factor 9A during the first step of the final common pathway, when factor 10 is converted to 10A. More on that soon. Well, the forest isn't for everyone, but fortunately, this summer camp has a lot more to offer. Take this external creek. It's a bit more exposed to the elements and represents the extrinsic pathway, aka the tissue factor pathway. This pathway starts with tissue factor, that's factor 3, which becomes exposed to blood after injury to a vessel, and is represented here by this injured hiker nursing his bleeding knee with a tissue. The extrinsic pathway also begins with factor 7, which circulates in the blood and has the shortest half-life. We've given this hiker a stylish 7-shaped walking stick as a symbol. Factor 7 binds to tissue factor, producing the active 7-ATF complex. This active complex, represented by our 2 hikers sharing this canoe, can also catalyze the activation of factor 10 to 10A during the first step of the final common pathway, which we'll turn to now. The final common pathway is where the intrinsic and extrinsic pathways merge, kind of like how the cascade from the trees merges with the external creek to form this common river. As we mentioned, the common pathway begins with a conversion of factor 10 into 10A. This can be triggered by factor 9A with cofactor 8A from the intrinsic pathway, or by the 7A tissue factor complex from the extrinsic pathway. Factor 10 is symbolized by this photographer who is wearing a safety vest marked with a big X and is crossing the bridge with his camera at the ready. Having crossed the bridge and spotted something in the river, he's now taken some really good action shots. A helpful reminder of activated factor 10A. You'll notice he's also using a camera stand in the shape of a V because activated factor 10 uses cofactor 5A to convert prothrombin to thrombin. So, what's our photographer spotted in the river? Thrombivers! After prothrombin is converted to thrombin, or when baby thrombivers grow into adult thrombivers, thrombin catalyzes the conversion of fibrinogen, or factor 1, into fibrin, factor 1A. That's why these adult thrombivers are gnawing these big fibrinogen logs into smaller fibrin sacs. Just like these sticks aggregate to form a dam, fibrin monomers aggregate to form a fibrin polymer mesh, a mesh that is stabilized by activated factor 13, like how these 13-shaped pilings are sporting this newly formed fibrin dam. Thrombin also activates several other factors, including factors 5, 8, and 13. To help you remember this, we've added in a few more thrombivers, playing with this other V-shaped camera stand, having the time of their life in the 8-shaped inner tube, and making repairs to the 13-shaped pilings. Another helpful way to remember these thrombin-activated factors is with the mnemonic 5 plus 8 equals 13. No matter how well built, thrombiver dams and fibrin clots aren't meant to last forever, and the fibrinolytic system becomes activated whenever thrombi need to be cleared. In this system, tissue plasminogen activator, TPA, is released from endothelial cells and converts plasminogen into plasmin. So who are you going to call? The Park Authority, or TPA, clotbusters. Plasmin does the actual clot dissolving, which is why our TPA ranger is using a plasma torch to clear this thrombiver dam. People with ischemic strokes and pulmonary emboli are sometimes given synthetic TPA to break up clots, which sounds far more pleasant than getting plasma torched by the Park Authority. After plasmin dissolves the clot, fibrin degradation products such as D-dimer are left behind, kind of like this leftover, charred, D-shaped debris. And with that, we've reached the end of our journey down the coagulation cascade. Before we kick off our boots and settle in around the campfire, let's review what we've learned. Factors 10, 9, 7, and 2, and the anticoagulation proteins S and C are vitamin K dependent. In the intrinsic pathway, coagulation factors are activated in this order: 12, 11, 9, and then 10. Inactive factor 8 normally circulates bound to von Willebrand factor, but separates from VWF once activated so that it can act as a cofactor for factor 9A. In the extrinsic pathway, factor 7 and tissue factor form the active factor 7A-TF complex that can also catalyze the first step of the final common pathway, which begins with the conversion of factor 10 to 10A. Factor 10A then uses cofactor 5A to convert prothrombin to thrombin. Thrombin catalyzes the conversion of fibrinogen to fibrin and activates factors 5, 8, and 13. These fibrin monomers aggregate to form the fibrin polymer mesh, which is then stabilized by factor 13. The fibrinolytic system is activated when thrombi need to be cleared. In this system, plasminogen is converted to plasmin by tissue plasminogen activator, TPA, to break up clots. After plasmin dissolves a clot, fibrin degradation products such as D-dimer are left behind. That was a bit of a bruiser. I think it's time to stop the flow of this sketch and head back to camp. Just keep an eye out for that squirrel with the menacing side eye. The last thing I need is a blood feud with a squirrel. Not again. Not again.